Hegemonic masculinity man. Hegemonic masculinity man. Masculinity man. Everything.
Hey Hunter, do you want to come over to my house after netball training? Mum bought this frozen cupcake mix that we could make. Okay.
Hegemonic masculinity man. Stop right there, young Epicene child. Domesticity is not for one such as you.
Huh? What? Look out, it's hegemonic masculinity man.
Frozen cupcakes epitomise all that is wrong with you millennial men.
That was testosterone filled. What do you expect? It's hegemonic masculinity man. 1 minute he's all deadpan, next he's all excessive rage.
No netball either. Don't you want to grow up to be the toughest young man out there?
Hey, you said the other day when you helped me when I fell over that netball was a really cool...
You need to build up your physical strength. Here, take this protein shake.
You can't bully us into acting how you want.
Hush, you!
Well...
Right, my work here is done.
Hegemonic masculinity man. Huh. Well, that happened. Masculinity. We've all heard about it, and we all have a rudimentary idea of what it is. The word masculine is derived from the Latin word mas, which means male, so anything masculine is naturally assumed to be associated with that which identifies with male gender. So appropriately, in regards to masculinity, Collins English Dictionary says... Wait, never mind, my copy doesn't have a proper definition. Well, if we go by the definition of masculine, yes, being masculine. Well, being masculine is possessing qualities or characteristics considered typical or appropriate to a man. Maybe I could look up a better definition? Okay, masculinity is the possession of the qualities traditionally associated with men. It also lists as synonyms the word virility, manliness, maleness, vigor, strength, muscularity, ruggedness, amigo, toughness, robustness, actually, and its opposite,
femininity.
Another definition is that masculinity is the cause of the presence of male hormones, resulting in sexual initiative, action, intelligence, and an interest in career. But I think you get the point. There's thousands of different perspectives on masculinity and a plethora of people, constructs, and characters that embody and celebrate the traits associated with it. In the late 1970s, a sociologist known as Raewyn Connell, be warned, that's a name you'll hear a lot studying this, conducted a study into teenage boys at Australian high schools and found that hierarchies of masculinity were observable, rather than a homogeneous collective. Homogeneous, whatever. The phenomenon by which multiple different forms of masculinity existed was dubbed, multiple masculinities. Creative, I might add. In turn, these all contribute to the perpetuation of the big daddy of masculinities, hegemonic masculinity. So we know what masculinity is. What makes hegemonic masculinity so different? Well, the hegemonic part derives from hegemony, which, as we know, is ascendancy or domination of one power or social class over others. You might have guessed that in and of itself, hegemonic masculinity was first born from the Marxist concept of cultural hegemony. So, whilst ordinary masculinity might be generally associated with toughness, emotional distance, physical prowess, etc., etc., hegemonic masculinity concerns itself with suppressing femininities and other forms of masculinities as it does so. Whilst hegemonic masculinity man...
Someone called?
No, they didn't. Bugger off. Anyway, whilst hegemonic masculinity man before was a pretty exaggerated scenario, it alludes to just how such a thing can attempt to subjugate not only femininities, but other masculinities. It also demonstrates, albeit with a slightly subverted example, how women are also imperative to the formation of these. Men subordinating other men? What is this gobbledygook? Well, funny you should ask, actually. Surely you've heard the expression, not all men? Yeah. Not all men are comfortable with repressing other men and women. In this regard, there have also been numerous other criticisms of hegemonic masculinity about it being too insular, too diametrically insalubrious to the normal development of men and masculinities, and too removed from what is observable in social dynamics. However, when stepping back and examining gender hierarchies, we see a more complex side to it. This is where multiple masculinities come into play, because, let's face it, not every man is a paragon of machoism. And that's okay, it's normal, it's fine. As Stanistreet has written of Connell's works, these aspects reflect the practices and relations that construct the main patterns of masculinity in the current Western gender order. Observable in Connell's writings on multiple masculinities, and by default femininities, are four identifiable facets that are inextricably linked either through mutual benefit, contradicting or domineering one another. Our dear friend hegemonic masculinity sits at the centre, and whilst it gets to lord it over everyone else, it exists only in relation to the others, subordinate, complicit, and marginalised masculinities. Drawing lines elucidating the dynamic relations between them all demonstrates not only the complexities, but highlights the potentially fluid nature of these seemingly contradictory and irreconcilable concepts. Lines. Let's start with complicit masculinities. Complicit masculinities are those that most directly and indirectly affirm hegemonic masculinity, although they don't necessarily completely align with the ideals and interests of it. Ultimately, though, it benefits from the domination over women and other masculinities in much the same manner. As a result, complicit masculinities are in the least favourable position compared to other masculinities by which to challenge hegemonic masculinity. Some might say, contentiously, or not, that the vast majority of men fall under the spectrum of complicit masculinity, owing to the default advantage they are awarded by virtue of simply being male, predisposed to greater power, wealth, status, etc. Then there's subordinate masculinities. Subordinate masculinities are those actively subjected to the worst of hegemonic masculinity's dominance, used to solidify the latter's power and legitimacy. Unlike the other multiple masculinities, subordinated ones have less relation to factors such as class, race, culture, ethnicity, and more to do with sexuality. Think of the manner in which gay men are treated in society, disregarding the politics over the greater subaltern status of their female counterparts. Things have improved vastly in the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of their relationships compared to heterosexual ones, yet some exceptionally patriarchal circles they are still regarded as subpar. The common trope where a gay character is bullied by one of the jocks has its foundations in the relations between hegemonic masculinities and subordinated ones in order to assert hegemony, machoism, denial of emotions, and violence must be used to validate it. However, subordinate masculinities are not only limited to homosexuality alone. Anyone who expresses more epicene qualities can experience the same marginalization. Which brings us, coincidentally enough, to marginalised masculinities. Marginalised masculinities are analogous to subordinate ones, except that instead of revolving around sexuality, they instead are centred around class and ethnicity. Oh, one similarity I forgot to mention. Marginalised and subordinate masculinities share is that they tend to be prevalent in younger males, as it is a period of their lives when issues regarding identity are particularly exacerbated. As such, whilst not clashing with the ideals of hegemonic masculinity entirely, marginalised masculinities may instead attempt to adopt traits of the former to try and overcome their status. Which brings us lastly to protest masculinities. Protest masculinities, as the name suggests, carry the most potential to undermine the hegemonic status quo. In short, according to Connell, what this entails is a focus on active heterosexual practices which, along with the level of tension that follows from poverty, leads to an ambience of violence. What's worth noticing though is that, well, any form of masculinity that does not fully endorse the apex has the potential to transmogrify into protest. Complicit masculinities, whilst initially being the direct antithesis, can become less so if there grows to be less compliance with their principles. Similarly, motivated by injustice, marginalised masculinities may seek to lash out and attempt to subdue the masculinities they see as oppressing them, paradoxically becoming like them through the coercion they employ. As dire as this might sound, and as hegemonic masculinity may sound, as I've said, these masculinities can come to challenge the hegemonic status quo. In fact, in general, all of these are subject to change. I've seen the word mutation used to describe the way in which they change, but I think this sounds a bit unpleasant. They evolve, not only consequently due to the passage of time, challenge from other conflicting masculinities, enlightenment, and most importantly, context. Gender hierarchy operates differently within friendship groups, workplaces, schools, strangers, and masculinities will adapt accordingly. However, hegemonic masculinity has the most rigid parameters, and the most universal limiting factor on it is, arguably, age. As Spector Mersel says, Western masculine scripts are not designed for elderly men, and that much is evident in how much physical fitness, virility, mental acuity just no longer function as they once did over time. Masculinities are not entirely concrete, especially considering that, as Connell says, biological sex is not seen as the determining factor in social practice. Thus, gender is no longer viewed as two autonomously homogeneous categories, but rather as configurations of practice within social relations that operate not just between men, but also between men and women at any one historical moment. Women have a crucial role in the construction of masculinities in interaction with boys and men, but in saying that, hegemonic masculinity remains somewhat exclusive in that hegemony can only emanate from masculinity and continue to be expressed through masculinity. But as we've seen, despite living in the bounds of a patriarchal society, not all men stand to benefit from hegemonic masculinity. As for multiple factors, not all men will be able to obtain that lofty ideal. Whilst Connell's criticism originates from a Western perspective, notably from observations in an Australian context, and many nations possess a similar societal structure like it, as mentioned earlier, whilst many men would form part of complicit masculinities, a great proportion would fall in the bounds of marginalised or subordinate masculinities, owing to the fact that they just aren't white, heterosexual, mature, wealthy, physically fit, or able-bodied. As a result of researching hegemonic masculinity, my thesis on selected works of Haruki Murakami has evolved from simply looking at the representation of women in his works to scrutinising their roles and function in relation to the endorsement or subversion of patriarchal culture. Despite the fact that I'm dealing with international literature, namely by a Japanese author in a Japanese setting, I believe that multiple masculinities are still pertinent to scrutinising characters and narratives in much the same way. Primarily, this is because other masculinities are still marginalised and women are still subjected to similar scrutiny and repression. Furthermore, literature such as that of Haruki Murakami's has quite the global fan base, and one can presume that this is due to traits that make it readily identifiable within a global context, hence why it should be subject to the same scrutiny. Indeed, as Connell notes, the interrelation is centred on a single structural fact, the global dominance of men over women, subjugating by similar means of institutionalised subservience and domesticity, and thus such criticism remains pertinent. And that's that. There's a lot more that could be disseminated on multiple masculinities, and it may sound funny that as someone initially concerned with women and their representation in literature that I focus on masculinities as opposed to femininities, but approaching it from this perspective enables a more profound understanding as to the problematic elements surrounding their characterization and narrative influence. My rambling spiel today is but a superficial canapé, but I hope it has proved somewhat beneficial in provoking your interest in exploring this aspect of gender theory. Thank you for watching.